So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you for coming. I hope this ends up being interesting and useful to you. I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about the background of this work. This is work that grew out of clinical experience I had as a psychology graduate student in the middle of the state of Ohio, in two small clinics, actually, one in Canton and one in Alliance, Ohio. It was at this point in my life that it was actually this was the first time I had a full-time job. I had gotten a job as a therapist in this small clinic in Canton, Ohio. And the first thing I learned is that in this clinic, the new guy gets all the people who no one has any idea of how to help. And in fact, this is an old, ancient time, and some of you may have heard of this, but there weren't computers, but there were note cards. There were these small little cards in a sort of a rectangular shape with lines on them, and they had people's names and phone numbers and addresses typed on them. And you got a stack of these note cards, and that was to be your caseload. And as I mentioned, as the new guy at this clinic, I got all the note cards for patients who other therapists didn't have much of a sense of how to help, or they might even have thought you couldn't help these people. And as it turned out, these were many people, adults, who had severe and persistent mental illness, serious mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. And as an energetic young graduate student, happy to finally be making money and eating more than peanut butter, I set to work trying to be helpful, trying to understand how to relate to more severely disturbed patients. And miraculously, with time, it seemed as if things happened. I'll tell you that these are patients who, when I first met them, appeared to live sort of in a fog. More or less, they had little sense of their personal history. There was almost no sense of goals or aspirations. There were very vague, barren descriptions of other people and historical events. And yet, the more I met with these people, the more their histories seemed to come into focus, the more mental activities appeared to sort of reignite in their minds, and they began to think. And there were substantial and unexpected changes. This happened for about 4 years in the middle of the 1980s and ended when I went on my internship traveling to the East Coast to complete my degree. And I left, I think, with a sense of frank marvel that so many things could happen in a psychotherapy session for a patient who had a severe mental illness. But I also left with a sense of I had no idea how this had happened. I had no working model to explain what I had helped people to do and how to describe the kinds of transformations that had occurred. And so what I'm going to talk to you about now for the rest of this time is essentially work that's tried to answer these questions. It's tried to get at, if you help someone in psychotherapy, what are you really doing? Someone with severe and persistent mental illness. And at the core, what is it that's really being addressed? So I'm going to start by going back to the work of Bleuler, who was, of course, the historical figure who coined the term schizophrenia. And I'll tell you that when I read Bleuler in translation, albeit, I think that he looks out at an asylum full of men and women and encounters the following paradox. These are people who previously had rich lives with regular trajectories, who loved, who worked, and that's all been profoundly interrupted. And it has been interrupted in the absence of the gross kinds of cognitive deficits, such as those found in dementias. In other words, there was no collapse of the cognitive system, and yet people's lives had collapsed. And Bleuler, working with Jung, sought out to develop some sort of theory about what this might reflect. And I'm going to begin with Bleuler's theory because I think it contains important things that can help illuminate what happened in those early psychotherapy cases and also tell us a lot more about the kinds of psychotherapy that can be helpful to people with severe and persistent mental illness. So as some of you may know, Bleuler had 4 A's that he used to describe the foundational disturbances in schizophrenia, and the first of those is association. And what Bleuler describes in his book is that persons in his asylum appeared to have lost the ability to link ideas together, to connect ideas through association. And as a result, people weren't merely just illogical, but they couldn't form the kinds of complex ideas that we all need to have about ourselves and the world to navigate life. Bleuler describes how really odd things could be combined together in incoherent ways, but also how the larger picture of a life was erased. And I quote from him, and he says, as a result of all of this, the patient hardly knows how to orient himself either inwardly or outwardly. And a very intelligent patient needs hours of strenuous effort to find her own ego, even for a brief moment. Bleuler's work is interesting. Contemporary historians talk about his efforts to sort of reconcile Freud and Kraepelin. These efforts to reconcile Freud and Kraepelin included a wish to move away from a view of schizophrenia as merely a progressive collapse of the mind and in some way bring in the person into the heart of the disorder. Kraepelin, though, ultimately responds to some of the ideas that Bleuler puts forth, and in 1919 writes that dementia praecox, Kraepelin's word for schizophrenia, that it's a series of states in which the common characteristic is a peculiar destruction of the internal connections of the psychic personality. In essence, Kraepelin comes to describe also the sort of collapse of the person, the sort of things that make us unique beings in the world. Around the same time, Freud also is describing psychosis and making some of the very same suggestions. So Bent Rosenbaum, a prominent contemporary psychoanalyst in Copenhagen, writes that Freud considered that instead of binding images and affects and ideas into coherent wholes, a process of unbinding took place in schizophrenia, and there was a loss of any coherent apperception of the world. I continue with Rosenbaum, and he says the unbinding causes a breach in the unity and identity of the self and threatens the many symbolic links characterizing its integrating capacities in reality testing. So in summary, I begin with the idea that at the heart, when the term schizophrenia was first posed, we were directed to look at the collapse of consciousness and the collapse of any sort of rich, coherent sense of who a person is and who others are in the world. And that might then describe the profound interruption of a life. This sort of core, though, has been lost. In the 1950s, Kurt Schneider focused deeply on the sort of bizarre and odd experiences that people with psychosis have. In the 1980s, the focus shifted back to some of the negative symptoms that really Kraepelin had been described, and Nancy Andreasen talks at length, but other sort of core facets of this condition which involve the sort of loss of emotion and the sort of dimming of vitality. And if we go all the way to the DSM-5, our contemporary nomenclature, we see a bunch of fragments as descriptions of schizophrenia. In other words, there are lots of small bits and pieces, and there's no coherent idea of how they fit together or what they represent. So I think we've come to a spot in our history where it's unclear what severe persistent mental illness really is, particularly schizophrenia. We have a bunch of fragments, and this sort of thread that Bleuler offered us is missing. I've looked in other sources, though, in our contemporary world. One of my cool friends, to go unnamed, told me that if you want to know anything, you should watch TED Talks. So I followed her advice, as I do often. And I've watched a number of prominent TED Talks about what schizophrenia is. And I'm calling to mind right now 2 excellent talks, one by someone who herself suffered from schizophrenia. But what she really seems to describe are a bunch of strange experiences followed by stigmatization and poor psychiatric treatment. So in the end, I still don't know what this condition is, other than that it's strange and causes people to treat you poorly. And I believe this to be a valid perspective, but it doesn't lead me to any core of the disorder. Another prominent TED Talk, also an excellent talk, really describes this as a condition that exists on the human continuum of odd thinking. So more or less, it appears that this is a condition in which people sort of think oddly and don't snap out of their odd thoughts. Neither of these, though, again, describe the people, I think, in Bleuler's asylum whose lives had been interrupted. And I think we in some ways have lost the thread of Bleuler and this whole tradition of looking at consciousness because it's so hard to concretize or measure this phenomena, this business of linking ideas together and coming up with a rich integrated sense of who one is and who other people are. So what I plan to do with this talk from here on out is I want to first use the word metacognition to describe some of these experiences that we all have in which we bring ideas together. I want to then talk about a way to measure it quantitatively. I want to talk about this as a concrete phenomena that can be not only described but measured. I'm then going to talk about research that has supported this model, and we will move from there, finally, to talk in some depth about the implications of this for psychotherapy. So let's go back to this idea, as at least I've framed it, that Bleuler tells us that in schizophrenia, people have lost this ability to link ideas together and create a complex sense of self and others. I'm going to use the word from here on out, metacognition, to describe that process. And I'll begin, though, with the caveat that metacognition is a term that's been used differently by different audiences and used very differently in different fields. In the field of education, metacognition has been used to describe awareness of one's learning style. In cognition and in cognitive research, metacognition has been used to describe one's knowledge of one's own memories. In psychopathology, it's been used to describe the types of things one tends to focus on. And in attachment theory, it's also been used to describe the complex process by which human beings come to form ideas of themselves and others in close relationships, often with primary caretakers. For the duration, though, I'm going to talk about metacognition as a spectrum of activity. It is a broad range of activities that happen in one's own mind, and it spans both discrete activities in which there's the noticing of a particular thought or feeling, and more synthetic activities where lots of information is integrated together into relatively complex whole senses of self. So in this way, metacognition refers to multiple activities that occur at multiple levels. Importantly, though, these discrete and synthetic activities inform each other. In other words, the very specific things I believe about myself or other people, the things I notice about myself, those pieces, I need to have those to integrate into the larger whole. But on the other hand, the larger whole also helps me to interpret and make sense of the smaller things. If I realize I've become angry or upset, my larger picture of my life may help me understand my anger or my irritation. Importantly, metacognition, though, is not a hypercognitive activity. It isn't something that we do late at night in the laboratory or in very heady conversations with only the most intelligent people that we know. We do it every day, all the time, across multiple settings, including the most casual settings, such as cooking hamburgers with someone on the grill. So, as an illustration, if you think about someone you know, you first meet them and you form an idea of who they are pretty instantaneously. The next time you meet them, you may remember some of those things, but you get a different picture and then you create a somewhat new idea of who they are. And hopefully every time you meet this person, your idea of them grows and becomes richer as you integrate more and more information. The ideas you form about people also are relevant, are made relevant because of the context. So if I form an idea of my cool friend because she's a student who's working with me, I may create a different image of her than if she's decided to date my younger brother. So these ideas are fluid, they're changing. They happen not just when you look into someone's eyes and you hear their life story, but you watch how they act, their mannerisms, just your own even basic reaction to them. So I guess I've hoped to clarify early on that metacognition, again, is not merely a judgment or a theory I form about someone else, but it's a process by which lots of information from multiple sources comes together. And the model of metacognition I'm going to use is one put forth by Antonio Semerari in a paper first published in 2003. And in this paper, Semerari, along with colleagues, including Giancarlo Damasio, suggests that metacognition involves four broad domains. And those are self-reflectivity, or thoughts about oneself, awareness of others' mental states, or thoughts about other people, decentration, which refers to a picture of the larger world and how things fit together, and ultimately the fourth component is mastery, or the ability to use this knowledge in order to understand how to respond to emergent challenges. There are key assumptions behind this work that I want to make plain before we go further. The first is that human beings differ in their capacities for metacognition. I may be better at integrating information than others, while others may be better than I. I'm going to also suggest a key assumption is that metacognitive capacity can be measured. In other words, we can detect and pinpoint someone's capacity within a reasonable degree. Certainly, metacognition and the capacity for metacognition vary across different circumstances. It's far easier to think about oneself in the quiet room at night than it is on a noisy bus, and it's especially difficult to think about oneself in the middle of a deeply emotionally upsetting argument or a loss. But nevertheless, I'm going to assert that human beings tend to have a basic ability to do this, which varies again between persons. As important as anything else I'll say, metacognition is also an intersubjective act. In other words, the ideas I form about myself or other people are not merely ideas that I get to create in my own head independent of other people. So this may come as a deep shock to you. I suspect not to everyone, but to some. But in the place where I work, not everyone thinks I'm funny. Probably many of you who are watching this now have left the room in sheer disgust, and I hope you'll come back soon. But the fact is, you don't get to decide if you're funny. You don't get to decide if you're empathic. People who decide they're really empathic and no one else thinks they are appear foolish. I don't get to decide that I'm not a narcissist. There are many things I don't get to decide about myself. These are things that are decided with other people. And these are complex ideas about myself. Again, we're not talking about a specific thing I believe or don't believe, but a way in which ideas are put together that give you a sense of who you are, or that gives me a sense of who I am or who other people are. So this is all relevant because perhaps this is one of the core problems that Bloiler picks up. Perhaps this is one of the core things that the patients were struggling with in the early setting I described to you. That is this ability to put information together and have a complex sense of self or others. You might ask, and should, well, how would that happen? Why would metacognition be so poor in people who experience severe and persistent mental illness? Well, another key assumption behind this whole construct is that one could experience deficits in metacognitive capacity for many different reasons. There could be developmental failures. There could be a series of poor relationships early on or trauma in which people fail to develop this idea or this ability to bring information together about themselves and others. But there could also be brain damage that goes along with severe and persistent mental illness. There could be the loss of neurocognitive functions, which as a result, people therefore struggle to create complex ideas of self and others. Lastly, people might not put complex ideas together about themselves and others because it's too painful. In other words, they may prefer a less rich or coherent idea of themselves in the world because there have been loss or other events that are too much to bear. I don't want to suggest these are the sole causes of metacognitive deficits, but instead I want to say that this is an intersubjective phenomenon. People vary according to their abilities, and that there might become deficits or loss of this capacity for various reasons. I'm going to mention, though, that there are a number of related concepts to metacognition that it's worth thinking a little bit about. Hopefully, I'll be able to distinguish metacognition from some of these other ideas. One very prominent and well thought out described construct is the term of mentalization. Mentalization shares with metacognition an interest in how human beings form ideas about themselves and others. Metacognition, I will suggest, differs in some ways from mentalization in that it speaks to phenomena which occur across a broad number of contexts and is not solely tied to a human attachment. In other words, failures in metacognition can occur outside of attachment relationships. Metacognition is also deeply concerned with the use of metacognitive knowledge in order to respond to problems. It is not merely a matter of knowing oneself, but of the use of that knowledge. There are other terms, though, that are similar: theory of mind, social cognition. I'll tell you that I think metacognition differs from these somewhat in that it focuses on the complexity and integration of ideas, not on their correctness. In a typical theory of mind test, you'll show me a picture of a face, and I'll guess, is this person happy, bored, homicidal? And you'll decide whether I have good theory of mind on the basis of whether I'm correct or not. But metacognition is not about correctness entirely. So if there are 5 people sitting around the room and looking at one person, those 5 people may have a very different idea of that one person. And they may have some of those ideas may be similar, but there's not one right idea of him. But these ideas may vary in terms of complexity. Someone who's known him for years, someone who just met him. Metacognition is also analyzed as it occurs in discourse. The ideas that we form about ourselves are not abstract theories that come as a result of calculations, as I have suggested to you earlier. So in this sense, theory of mind and social cognition appear to be more interested in very discrete phenomena rather than the full spectrum. There are other constructs: mindfulness, observing ego, emotional intelligence, psychological mindedness, that are related. I won't go into detail, but I think metacognition may in some ways be distinguished from these as well, again in its focus on synthesis and its deep interest in the use of this knowledge to figure out how to respond. I'll mention that this is also, though, more than a matter of purely a coping skill. So if my metacognition is, if I'm functioning metacognitively at a relatively adaptive level, I use my knowledge to decide what to do in particular circumstances. And that should differ based on my sense of myself, the qualities of the conflict, and the people involved. So my responding to conflicts is based on my knowledge of the people with me, but also different types of conflicts. I'm aware there are things I'm more avoidant of. There are things that I jump into quickly. And my knowledge of myself, therefore, should always guide. And in this sense, I think, again, metacognition becomes more than just being mindful, but it involves the bringing together of all of this complex, impossibly difficult material into some sort of workable sense that directs behavior. Perhaps, though, this description makes it clear why ideas like Bleuler's and others fell away. How in the world could you measure how carefully material is integrated or brought together? It seems like just such a matter of judgment or feeling. Like, I feel like that's right. I mean, indeed, if you think about people who you think know you, you feel like they got it right. It feels like they understand you. So how could you measure this quantitatively without doing violence to it, without reducing it to something that's meaningless? So there are plenty of approaches to measuring things like theory of mind and social cognition. I've alluded to some. There are pictures in which you have to guess correctly an emotion in the face of another. There also are stories in which you have to imagine what a protagonist wants or intends. There are tasks where people are asked to see if they can remember parts of their life, whether they can tell they're the source of an action. But as you can tell, none of these are really getting at integration. Clearly, if you could get no details correct around you, it would be hard to create an integrated idea. An additional problem with these measurement approaches, though, is that they're also pretty neutral. And again, it is really easy to think about things in the abstract, and not quite the same as guessing someone's emotions when they're angry at you or you accidentally have hurt their feelings. Or maybe even hurt their feelings on purpose, if some of you have ever done that. These are also tests in which metacognitive judgments are cued. People are asked to think about something and to make a judgment. And as you might have noticed, often happens in life, people don't grab a hold of you and say, now tell me, what do I feel? What do I want? Who are you? Oftentimes, these things emerge spontaneously. And it is certainly conceivable that I could be good at guessing someone's emotions when they direct my attention to it. But otherwise, I don't get it. So, facing this difficult task, and working with a number of colleagues, my group developed an interview. And in this interview, we tried to get a hold of a person's sense of their life and themselves. And it would be hypothetically an interview within which metacognitive capacity could emerge and potentially be rated. So the interview bears the unfortunate name of the Indiana Psychiatric Illness Interview. The truth be known, we had a contest to create a very cool name and it failed. So this is our interview. Thanks to a wonderful colleague from Canada, we call it the IPI. I will refer to it as the IPI from here on out. But the IPI lasts 30 to 60 minutes. It's an interview in which a person has an opportunity to talk about life and challenges. It is not like symptom interviews in that it doesn't ask about specific problems. We do not ask, for example, how is your drinking? Are you depressed? Have you been homicidal? Comments are non-directive and the tone is conversational. There are 6 prompts to the IPI. Tell me the story of your life. Do you think you have a mental illness? Or in some adaptations of the IPI, do you have a medical illness? Or have you had a significant psychological or emotional challenge? The 3rd prompt is, because of this, what has changed and what has not changed in your life? The next prompt, what do you control about this and what about this controls you? Next, how does it affect others? How do others affect it? And finally, what do you see in the future? And the goal of the IPI then is a sample in which we can glimpse how life in the experience of challenge is narratized. And it's an opportunity where naturally people should begin to share how they bring information together into a sense of who they and others are. It is impossible to do an interview and to be silent because, of course, people won't talk if the interviewer says nothing or is blank. But the hope is that the interviewer provides minimal scaffolding, does not ask so many questions as to provoke metacognitive activity that does not occur naturally. So our methods for measuring metacognition involve getting a narrative interview using the IPI. We then transcribe this interview, although it could be videotaped conceivably and watched. And then we turn the transcripts over to a rater who then rates metacognition. So what I'm going to talk about now in the next segment is the scale we use to rate metacognition. I talked about the work of Semerari and my dear friend Giancarlo Damasio in Italy and their development of this construct of metacognition. And they created a scale called the Metacognition Assessment Scale. And with their permission, we adapted it and turned it into a dimensional scale called the Metacognition Assessment Scale, abbreviated. I will refer to it here on out as the MASS-A. And the MASS-A has 4 subscales. So what a rater does when they get the IPI transcript is they rate each of these 4 scales. And those numbers give us a sense of the metacognitive capacity of the person. So the 4 scales are self-reflectivity, understanding the mind of the others, decentration, and mastery. We have materials to go along with this that will help guide you through how to do these ratings, but I'm going to say a little bit to give you a rough idea of what the rating scales involve and how they're carried out. In short, higher levels, higher scores on the MASS-A reflect more integrated, complex representations of self and others. The ranges for the scales are as follows: self-reflectivity, the lowest score conceivable is a 0, the highest is a 9. For understanding the minds of others, the lowest score is a 7, lowest score is a 0. For understanding the mind of the others, the lowest score is a 0, the highest is 7. For decentration, 0 to 3, and mastery, 0 to 9. I'm now going to say a little bit about how each of these scales operates. Again, though, we have materials available if you wish to learn in more depth how to do these ratings, and we recommend you do if you want to really master the psychotherapeutic methods we're going to talk about. So to begin with self-reflectivity, it is assumed that this is a set of hierarchical functions. In other words, there are basic things people have to do before they can do more complex things. And I will talk you through the 9 levels briefly. But at the first level, which would be the non-level, at the level of 0, you would have a person who's unaware that they have mental activities. At the next level, the first level, you have someone who's aware they have mental experiences, but are not quite sure that their mental experiences are their own. This could be a person, hypothetically, who experiences considerable amounts of thought insertion, or who can't tell the boundaries between what they think and others think. At the third level, at the second level, participants are not only aware that they have mental experiences, but they know that they are their own mental experiences. At the third level, a person can distinguish different cognitive operations from one another. So if you think through just the most basic level so far of this subscale, you're looking at whether someone knows they have mental experiences, whether they know their mental experiences are their own, and whether they're aware that their mental experiences are composed of multiple components or parts. At the fourth level, the person has a nuanced sense of emotions. At the fifth level, a person can recognize that the ideas that they have about themselves and others are changing and subjective. In other words, the ideas that I'm forming about myself change over time, and that I, as the person making sense, am fallible. At the sixth level, a person can recognize that what they think, expect, want, isn't necessarily match what reality offers. At the seventh level, then, knowledge of oneself is brought together within a specific event or narrative episode. In other words, at the seventh level, I not only have a nuanced sense of my emotions, I realize my thoughts are changeable, I not only know that what I hope for doesn't match reality, but I can bring all those pieces of knowledge about myself into a very specific event that's happened. At the eighth level, I can begin to link different narrative episodes with complex ideas of myself together. And at the ninth level, I have a coherent narrative of my life that spans over time. People often ask, how do you determine, though, whether someone can do these things? From a simple narrative, from a simple transcript. The response is that we take the transcript as a sample of how someone thinks, and from that, we form a clinical judgment about that person's ability to do these things. And so a rater will read the transcript and will decide that there isn't really a nuanced sense of emotion, that perhaps the person has a sense that they're going crazy or that they feel incredible tension, but there's no nuanced sense. And because these are hierarchical functions, once someone doesn't get a level, once they're not afforded credit for a level, credit cannot be afforded for any subsequent levels. As a small side point, we do allow half a point for levels, but with the rule that you can have no more than 1/2 a point following a half point, and you cannot have a full point following a half point. Hence, the person who's judged to meet the first 3 levels of the self-reflectivity scale would be given a 3. If they didn't match or didn't appear to meet the criteria for 4, their score would therefore stand at a 3. If they got half a point for 4, their score would be 3.5. If they got a full point for the 4th level, their score would be 4, and we would go to the 5th level and continue on. The anchor points for knowing the mind of the other are quite similar, and I will spend less time, but it follows the same basic idea. This is a this follows the same idea. It is a hierarchy of functions such that if you cannot attain the lower, more simple functions, you cannot meaningfully have more complex metacognitive functions happening. So at the 0 level, for the mind of the other scale, a person is unaware that other people even have mental activities or events. An example of this could be a person who thinks others are controlled by an alien force or a robot. At the first level, a person is at least aware that people have thoughts, but again, may not be sure that the thoughts of the other are their own. At the second level, a person is aware that others have thoughts, but know that the thoughts of the other people belong to them. At the third level of this scale, a person is able to recognize that other people have different distinct cognitive operations. In other words, not only does another person have his own thoughts or her own thoughts, but that there are multiple parts to that. There are wishes, dreams, hopes, emotions, memories, etc. At the fourth level of the O scale, a person can distinguish between significantly different emotions in other people. In other words, if I've achieved the fourth level, I have a sense that other people have nuanced emotions. And again, this is more than just realizing that someone's going crazy or their stomach hurts. It's a more nuanced sense of what's going on in their lives. At the fifth level, a person can make guesses about the intentions and mental states of others based on communicative gestures. In the sixth level, a person can form ideas about other people in which all these different pieces are brought together within a specific narrative episode of their life or a specific event that happened. And at the highest level of the scale, the seventh level, a person is able to bring all this stuff together about one instance in their life and connect it to multiple instances, again creating a larger picture of a life, linking themes together over time. The third scale is decentration. This scale captures the sense that the world doesn't have a single center, that it's composed of multiple people with multiple agendas, all going their own way, with independent relationships, all perceiving the world somewhat differently. Someone who achieves decentration, for example, could realize, again, 5 people could surround one person. They could all recognize something different about that one person in a valid sense. There are only 4 levels for the decentration scale. At the lowest level, a person doesn't recognize that they are not the center of the world. Or said otherwise, a person can only understand the world as something that is happening around and about them. Someone lacking decentration in this way, for example, could not walk into a room and think that things happening in the room are unrelated to them. In other words, someone with no decentration would walk into a room and think that everything had to do with them. Cleaning your glasses, drinking your Coke laced with something, all of those would have to do with me, they'd have to be about me if I had no decentration. At the first level, to get a score of 1 on decentration, someone has to realize that they aren't the center of the world and that other people have their own goals and reasons for doing these things, the things that they do. At the second level, there's the awareness that others can perceive the world differently than oneself. In other words, there are multiple perspectives which are legitimately different. So realizing that people disagree with me and calling them wrong would not qualify for this level of decentration. I'd have to realize that someone's other opinion has something to offer, regardless of its concordance with my opinion. And finally, at the highest level of decentration, the third level, you have people who can see the world as not having any center, but all of us pursuing our own goals, our own hopes, dreams, coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, different ethnicities, different abilities, and moving in our own direction in life. As in the other scales with decentration, if you can't get the lower levels, you are not afforded a chance at the higher points. The final scale on the Maths A, the Metacognitive Assessment Scale abbreviated, is Mastery. And this again is the concept of using metacognitive knowledge in order to respond to challenges or psychological problems. As I mentioned, this is a scale that goes from 0 to 9. At the lowest level, at the level of 0, you have someone who doesn't even realize they have any plausible problem at all, or even any implausible problem. Nothing's wrong, everything is fine. At a level of 1, there may be something wrong, but it's expressed in a very implausible way. At the second level, someone can plausibly describe a psychological challenge. I might say, for example, I hear voices And as a result, I find myself having few to any friends. Having few to any friends is certainly a plausible problem. At the third level, I'm able to respond to a plausible problem through, at the most, sheer avoidance. I block out the world. I don't leave my apartment or home. I don't go anywhere near anything that bothers me. At the fourth level, someone is able to respond to a plausible problem by seeking out support and comfort from other people. At the fifth level, a person is able to respond to a plausible problem by imposing a specific behavior on themselves, making themselves go for a bike ride, making themselves get out of their home and going and eating a meal in a restaurant. So if we think about the M scale so far, the mastery scale, we move at the beginning, the earliest stages of having nothing plausibly wrong, to increasingly healthier ways of responding to the dilemma. At the sixth level then, someone is able to change how they think about things. They're able to make a decision to think differently about what's in front of them. And at the seventh level, ultimately someone is able to respond to a challenge by using their knowledge of themselves in the light of what they're facing. In other words, if I've achieved the seventh level, I know that this particular problem is important to me because I tend to respond to problems like this in the following way, and I'm best off doing something different, again, given my unique integrated sense of who I am. At the eighth level, I can do that as well as use my knowledge of other people. I know that in my conflict with this person, I have a sense of who he or she is, and therefore can decide how, given my knowledge of them and myself, this is most likely can be dealt with. And at the final level of mastery, there's an ability to sort of use my knowledge of how the world works in general, to use my idea of how people within my own community generally fare. And oftentimes this involves some profound acceptance of the limitations that we all have when we face things that are troublesome or distressing. So our process to recoup and regather for a moment is this. To measure metacognition, we get a narrative, and we then, using the MASS-A scale that I've described, rate the extent to which someone can engage in metacognitive activity within the narrative. And hence, as I had mentioned earlier, someone unable to achieve the fourth level of the self-reflectivity scale would get a 3. Someone who could achieve the sixth but not higher scale on mastery would get a 6. Someone who achieved the first level of decentration but not the second would get a 1, et cetera, et cetera. To date, we have had quite good success with integrative reliability in multiple studies using multiple raters over the last 10 years. We've generally found interclass coefficients ranging between 0.7 and 0.91 for independent raters examining the same transcript. We've also had reasonable test-retest reliability. In one study of 48 cases over 3 points, we found interclass correlations ranging from 0.70 to 0.84, again suggesting some stability to this measure. In terms of the validity of this measure, certainly this is somewhat of a daunting task since there are not a plethora of methods available for analyzing the complexity of self-representation. But what I can tell you is across several studies we've found the following: that performance on the MASS-A is correlated with cognitive insight or the awareness in a questionnaire that one's thoughts are fallible. It has been related to traditional measures of awareness of illness. In other words, people with lower MASS-A scores have been found to be less aware that they have a mental illness. MASS-A scores have also been found to be correlated with assessments of social cognition using the Weston scoring system for the TAT. In other words, people with poor metacognition struggle to create complex accounts of the minds of others on the TAT test. People who report that they like to avoid problems tend to be rated as having poor metacognition. People who report on questionnaires, on the other hand, that they like to think about and talk about problems tend to have higher ratings of metacognition on the MASS-A scale. And lastly, people who are given higher ratings on the metacognition scale are actually more accurate appraisers both of their memory and their work performance as well. So I hope from this small snippet of information to provide you some information about the validity of this as a measure as well. I'm going to move next and tackle the so what question. So I think perhaps this sounds clever, perhaps it doesn't, but regardless, so what if someone has a score? What does it really mean? What is it telling us? And I'm going to say that the first thing it can do is it can tell us whether or not people with severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia indeed have lower metacognitive capacity. So this bright idea of Bleuler, or at least our interpretation of Bleuler, is it true? Does this group experience deficits in the ability to create complex ideas of themselves and others compared to other people? So I'll tell you across a number of studies that we've published, we have amassed a group of approximately 183 patients with schizophrenia. We've amassed a group of approximately 60 patients with substance abuse, some 70 patients with PTSD, and 51 patients with HIV. And we have gotten IPPEs from each of those groups. For the HIV patients, of course, we asked them not about mental health issues, but medical health issues. And for the HIV group, we included no HIV patients who had any severe kind of mental illness. As a control group, you can imagine that the HIV group has several advantages. And for us, the major one of those is that this is a group who faces considerable adversity. So many studies in which schizophrenia patients are compared to, quote, healthy controls, use control groups where people have little to no adversity and their lives are relatively smooth sailing. And it therefore is possible that any number of differences are found because of just the sheer disruption in life. So what we found is that the schizophrenia group, in fact, has lower self-reflectivity than the other three groups I mentioned. They struggle to do more than recognize their emotions. They have poor awareness of the minds of other people than the other three groups I mentioned. They are virtually unable, in general, to form a complex idea of the emotions of other people. The schizophrenia group also has considerably less decentration than any other group. Compared to substance abuse, PTSD, or HIV, this is a group that is barely able to see that they're not the center of all activity. And lastly, the mastery of the patients in the schizophrenia group is poorer than the PTSD and HIV participants significantly. It is roughly equivalent to the substance use group, and that appears to be an artifact of a fairly large number of patients within the substance abuse group who have severe borderline personality disorder, who appear to have mastery levels very similar to the schizophrenia patients. But to summarize, this methodology has enabled us to find, consistent with Bleuler, that indeed people with schizophrenia struggle relative to others to create complex ideas of themselves and others. I will tell you that these basic levels have been replicated in at least one study that was published in Israel using a group of patients in Haifa. These levels are also roughly equivalent to another group of patients who were studied in China as well as in Italy as well. So, in response to the first so what, this gives us a chance to see that there are these deficits and they exist. But are these deficits really part of the illness, or are they part of the whole problem of chronicity? Are the deficits we've found really just because people have been sick for a long time and leading marginalized lives, as many people with schizophrenia do? In the second study, therefore, what we did was to examine the metacognition of patients with prolonged schizophrenia. In this case, we took 72 people with a smaller group of 26 patients who were just in the very first episode of psychosis. And we again compared the MASS-A scores between these groups. Here for a control group, we took a younger group of people with substance misuse. And we purposefully chose the younger substance misuse as a control group to rule out the possibility that the narratives of the first episode patients might be different because of their age, because they were younger. Our findings were striking. The first episode patients and the prolonged patients both performed poorly on the metacognition scale. And actually, the first episode patients showed poor performance on awareness of the mind of the other and poor decentration than the prolonged patients. The mastery scores were equivalent between all groups, again, since the substance misuse patients continued to have a small core of patients with severe borderline personality disorder. The next part of the so what segment is, so what? Who cares if people have these deficits? Why does this matter? So I think if we go back to Bloiler, you would say these deficits matter because they interrupt people's lives. And it certainly makes sense. If you think about what does it take to sustain yourself through graduate school, through any number of changes in a career, through relationships, to pursue a course of action across a lifetime requires some sense of who you are and why you're doing it and who the other people are. So if you think about relationships that you've been able to sustain or hang on to over time, I would suggest that that's not too easy to do unless you have a sense of who that person is, and there's a reason why sticking with them matters, why you would do that. Same thing with a job. It's probably not an uncommon experience for people to get angry at their jobs and want to quit, or perhaps to throw their administrators out the window, or to be thrown out the window by their administrators, whatever is fair. But presumably we don't do that. We stick with our jobs, we find relationships that we're able to hang on to. And that's because of the ideas we form about ourselves and others. Hence, a very real hypothesis is that the poorer the metacognitive level is amongst patients with schizophrenia, the poorer the function should be. In other words, perhaps, as Bloiler suggests, life is getting interrupted because of a lack of these complex representations of self and others. I'll start out with a study that we published in 2010. We looked at 56 adults who were in a vocational rehabilitation program. These are all men in their late 40s. Many had relatively significant histories of hospitalization and substantial symptomatology. All were prescribed antipsychotic medication. And we divided this group into three based on their ability for self-reflection on the MASS-A. And this was a measurement gathered before they went to work. We then examined, subsequent to that, ratings of their work performance over the next 6 months. And in particular, what we did is every other week, we rated their work performance. That rating was done by someone who knew nothing about their metacognitive capacity, and we then tracked that over 6 months. And our finding was that, indeed, metacognition is relevant. The group with the highest level of self-reflectivity had significantly better work performance than the group with lower or mid-levels of self-reflectivity. They additionally learned faster. In other words, their work performance increased at a faster rate than that of the other two groups. Importantly, that finding persists even when controlling for neurocognition and psychopathology. So independent of how ill someone is in some general sense, metacognition was a predictor of the ability to succeed in a psychosocial rehabilitation program. We also have asked the question, what about self-experience of mental illness? In what way does the ability to form a complex idea of yourself or others affect your own sense of personal wellness in the midst of all of this condition? So here the hypothesis is that if I can't form a complex idea of myself or others, I'm going to struggle to feel in control of the condition. I'm going to have little hope. I'm going to be unable to reach out to others and ultimately feel profoundly dominated by that by my condition or my illness. This is a published paper from 2013. The first author is Marina Kukla. And in this study, we divided a sample into two groups. 18 had low to no self-reflectivity, and 27 or higher had at least middle levels of self-reflectivity. These are, again, all adults with severe and persistent mental illness. I'll mention they also are all adults in a non-acute phase of illness, as is true in the first study. After dividing the participants into those two groups, again, low reflectivity and basic reflectivity, we examined their self-report of wellness. And here we found that indeed the group with basic self-reflectivity reported significantly less domination by symptoms than the group with low to no self-reflectivity. And this is a finding that persisted when we controlled for severity of positive symptoms, negative symptoms, and disorganization symptoms. So once again, regardless of how symptomatic someone is, a more reflective person reports less domination by symptoms, or I should say a person better able to reflect. I think it's a core idea that lower levels of self-reflectivity doesn't mean someone isn't reflective. It means they are reflecting in a less complex way. In the same study, we also divided the sample in half in terms of whether there was no decentration. In other words, when I look out into the world, it's always about me, versus people who had some basic level of decentration, who could see that other people have their own agendas and hopes and dreams. And not surprisingly, the group with some decentration had more confidence and hope. They also reported they could ask for help, and they reported they felt they could rely on others. Not surprising, is it? If I see that there are other people who have their own thoughts, dreams, who have their own views, it might make sense to reach out to them, and I might be able to count on them. The next piece of evidence I want to present, and again in response to the so what, is that actually metacognitive functioning predicts how symptoms emerge over time. In other words, it may not just be a function of being iller or more ill or more disabled, but it may be a risk factor for the development of difficulties. And I'm going to talk next about a study we did in which we looked at participants over time and their levels of negative symptoms. And we asked the question whether or not people with poor levels of metacognition were more at risk over time to develop negative symptoms. In other words, this group with poor metacognition might have more negative symptoms to begin with, but aren't they at risk to develop even more negative symptoms? And so we tracked negative symptoms across 4 points in time. We had a group with high metacognition. This is a group of 17 adults, all with schizophrenia in a post-acute phase. We had 16 participants with medium levels of metacognition on the MASS-A, again all adults, and 20 with low levels of metacognition. The findings are striking. Those with low metacognition begin with higher levels of negative symptoms, but for this group, their negative symptoms also increase over time. They also grow and become more poignant and disabling. Again, those findings persist while controlling for other types of psychopathology. In a more recent study, we have turned to the question of whether or not metacognition might affect psychosocial functioning because it reduces motivation. In other words, one possibility here is that metacognitive deficits result in a loss of intrinsic motivation and therefore in a failure to connect to other people. So in other words, if you just think about it, your own motivations are based likely on how you appraise yourself and others. And if that ability is in some way damaged, might you not lose a sense of intrinsic motivation and then ultimately withdraw? In this sample, we gathered together 175 metacognitive assessment ratings combined with a similar number of ratings of intrinsic motivation and ultimately psychosocial functioning. Psychosocial functioning in this case was measured using the Heinrich's quality of life scale. And our finding was as predicted. In structural equation modeling, all indices of fit were met, and metacognition did affect functioning via a pathway through intrinsic motivation. And that persisted with controls in place for age, education, again, symptom severity, executive functioning, and additionally a third measure of social cognition. So in some ways, I think the most dramatic of the findings I've shared, suggesting that metacognition, as perhaps Bloyle would have expected, may tumble forward and end up disrupting functioning, leading to the interruption of life. I'm going to tell you about a few other general findings. Probably it would take 3 hours to detail every study that we've done or that our colleagues have done. But I'm going to mention that in addition to what I've talked to you about so far, that metacognition has also been found to predict levels of awareness of illness. In other words, poor insight predicts persons having a lesser sense that they're ill, but also a lesser sense of needing medication. It has been found to predict probabilistic reasoning bias. In other words, people with poor metacognition are more likely to jump to conclusions. It has been linked with functional deficits, both in terms of reduced numbers of social relationships, but also impairments in the ability to plan in a comprehensive way the events of one's life. Lower levels of metacognition have also been linked to a more sedentary lifestyle. In other words, people with poor metacognition are less active. There are other studies have found reductions in learning potential linked with metacognitive deficits. People with metacognitive deficits appear also less able to reject stigma or push away negative beliefs. Metacognitive deficits in a Danish sample were found to predict more severe impulsive levels of violence. And an interesting study just published by my group with Bethany Leonhardt as the first author, we found an interesting interaction in which metacognitive deficits were found actually linked to depression, but exclusively amongst persons with childhood sexual trauma. In other words, persons with histories of childhood sexual trauma became more depressed with greater levels of awareness. Backing up, I think also again, the idea that in some ways metacognitive deficits may have some protective defense against traumatic and overwhelming memories and beliefs. I've mentioned replication several times, but I'll mention again, there's been a study done in Haifa, which found very similar levels of metacognitive functioning to our own. They also included a healthy control sample who performed better than any of our control samples. There have been a number of studies in Denmark looking at chronic depression, which find metacognitive deficits in patients with chronic depression as well as first episode depression. In these studies, actually by Nikolai Ledegaard, there's the interesting finding that as depression remits, metacognition improves, but it does not go back to the levels one would expect from healthy controls. In French Canada, there's been a study with very similar means to ours with first episode patients. And there have been studies, as I mentioned, in China, as well as Turkey and Italy. The Italian and Chinese samples present MASS A scores that are somewhat lower than our own. Notably, these are not patients who are in any form of rehabilitation or treatment, which may partly explain this. Lastly, I have described research based on a narrative interview, and others, particularly in Scotland, have done this work rating metacognition on the basis of other interviews, such as the adult attachment interview, or in Denmark, people have used a psychopathology and psychopathy interview to get these ratings. So there are multiple sources that others have used to do the ratings.